Idle animations are mechanics in video games that I feel many people tend to overlook. There's so much time spent focusing on movements and graphics whilst playing the game that you don't really get the chance to just sit back and watch. Sure, you can boast about how fluid your jumps are or how snappy your hits are based on your actions, but what about how appealing it is to watch the animation of a character based on no actions? Although they might not seem like a big deal, I feel like idle animations are able to draw in a player more than they think. These animations help make a character feel a bit more real and believable. They can provide information about a character's state of emotion or their overall status, and when done correctly, they can add a bit of humor or personality to the game that you're playing. One of the earliest video game idle animations came from a 1978 computer game known as Android Nim. Never heard of it? Well, it's probably because it's for the TRS-80. This computerized strategy game was based on the mathematical game known as Nim, in which the winning player would remove or avoid removing the last object from a pile. Android Nim was just that, except it included androids inside your home computer. If it was the player's turn, and you just so happened to sit idle at your computer, then these little androids would sit in an idle animation where they would look left, right, and simply just blink. And for the most part, a lot of early video games from the 70s and 80s didn't have much depth when it came to these idle animations. Basic blinks and movements of the body were all that were really needed to help provide the player with the sense of this character being a little bit more real than just a bunch of pixels. Entering the early 90s, the fourth generation of gaming would start to see character sprites having a bit more detail in them. Home consoles such as the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo would start to see a vast variety in these animations. A sense of realness in these video game characters would really start to be explored around this time, as the 90s was, for whatever reason, filled with a bunch of big attitude gaming mascots. One character that's always been seen as having some of the greatest idle animations of this era had to have been Sonic the Hedgehog. In his first few games, a little bit of a fourth wall break would occur whenever the player would leave Sonic to do nothing, as after a few seconds of inactivity, he would object his eyes towards the player, begin tapping his foot, checking an imaginary watch, and also point his fingers in the way that the player should go. For a hedgehog that's all about going as fast as possible, seeing these passive-aggressive animations are perfect for his character. A few other 16-bit games that I think are really worth mentioning are of course Donkey Kong Country, because not only does our main protagonist, Donkey Kong, have an animation that's worth getting your attention by pounding on his chest and hollering, his sidekick Diddy Kong also has an animation in which he takes off his cap and scratches his head. Small things like this play into their character roles. As you can see, Donkey Kong is more courageous and ready to call out whoever, and on the other hand, Diddy Kong is a bit more curious and weary of what's around him. But of course, this sense of personality doesn't always have to be so serious. In Earthworm Jim, these animations are played with a bit more, as after a few seconds of inactivity, the animations can get a bit silly. If you give him a few moments, Jim begins to play around with his gun, accidentally bumping his head, entirely blasting his face off, and even trying to flex his muscles but having his pants fall down. A lot of these games once again have pretty basic animations when it comes to being away from the controller, where your character would pretty much just have simple side to side looks, a small movement in the arms, or just a simple breathing animation. Fighting games of course have always had fighting stances, which I think are pretty cool depending on the character. Leaving 16-bit and entering the 64-bit era of gaming would truly have an ultimate upgrade when it came to these idle animations. I'm going to mainly talk about the Nintendo 64 here because I think a lot of these games really played with the idea of rounding out a character's personality. The greatest one that of course everyone loves is none other than Mario in Super Mario 64. The Italian plumber from Brooklyn that somehow is on a quest to save a princess would have one of the most memorable idle animations of all time. If you were to leave Mario by himself after a few minutes, he goes on to say, "I'm tired," and proceeds to fall asleep right on the floor. And after a few more minutes go by, he'll begin to say a few phrases in his sleep.
Nighty nighty. Ah, spaghetti. Ah, ravioli. Ah, mamma mia.
This one is so great, I think not only because of how casual it is for Mario to just take a nap and start dreaming about pasta, but because of how realistic this makes Mario feel. In other games, it's so easy to leave a character alone for a little bit and come back to them still awake, bright as day, staring with no emotion, so this is a definite break in just the pixels and polygons on the screen. A few more silly animations that I'd like to mention that you would of course recognize are from bigger well-known Nintendo 64 titles such as Donkey Kong 64, where each Kong has their own animation after a few moments of inactivity. Probably the best one being Donkey Kong swallowing a fly and looking entirely embarrassed afterwards. Banjo-Kazooie. When left alone, Kazooie will come out of Banjo's backpack and give him a few pecks on the head just to make sure he's really all there. And one that I think is for specifically the cool kids to remember is Conker's Bad Fur Day. Of course, this little squirrel is going to have some interesting idle animations. This game alone had red flags because of its adultness. Drinking a few different beverages, checking his pocket watch, sitting around and waiting, playing with a yo-yo, and probably his best one, pulling out his Game Boy and playing some Killer Instinct. If your character in a video game was to receive the most amount of damage it could take before losing a life, you wouldn't want them to still be in an entirely perfect state of well-being. Why that is? Because it's just not engaging enough. Being able to show the overall status that your character is in from an idle animation gives that extra push from being just a bunch of polygons. For instance, in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, if you go somewhere very hot with our elf boy Link, you'll begin to realize that being all dressed up in a tunic in the desert does not serve him well. He begins to sigh and wipe sweat off of his forehead. And if you take him to somewhere cold such as the ice cavern, our elf boy begins to shiver, trying to warm himself up, and sneezes due to him feeling quite chilly. I think effects like this being carried all the way to modern day gaming such as Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are so freaking cool to see. Link begins to shiver when the temperature drops and he gets oh so cold. And when Link is in a warmer climate, he begins to sweat profusely. Of course, as the years have gone by, video games have become more and more detailed to the point where these beloved characters can have a ton of idle animations. The more memory your game allows, the more silly animations like this can be added in. Some of my personal favorite idle animations I've seen in the past and have witnessed myself have to be Wario breaking the fourth wall in Wario Land Shake It,
Come on, pick it up and play.
Donkey Kong, once again, playing his 3DS in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, and every time Kirby swings his little arms and sits down. God, I love that little guy. Obviously, I can't go on to look at every single fighting game stance or every single Pokemon battle stance, but there are some good ones to note. I love idle animations because of how well a personality can be shown when done correctly. It's this sense of realness and being able to encapsulate the viewer into becoming attached to a video game character, which I just love so much. So, yeah, idle animations are video game mechanics that are more important than you might think.